I'm delighted today to speak with Dr. James Kirby about his very recent publication, Choose Compassion, Why It Matters and How It Works. From the back, a timely and groundbreaking expose on how compassion can transform the suffering we face in the world. That was from Craig Foster. And Choose Compassion is a delight, a rich, humane, and beautifully written discussion of how we can be our very best selves. That was from Professor Paul Bloom. And I think it would be worth just reading from Professor Paul Gilbert. This book is a gem. It is full of up-to-date findings, reflections on crucial conceptual issues, and self-help guidance, all presented in an easy-to-understand way. It will be essential reading for anyone interested in how to cultivate and promote caring and compassionate behaviours in oneself and many areas of life. James Kirby is the co-director of the Compassionate Mind Research Group at the University of Queensland. He studies the effectiveness of compassion-focused therapy interventions in helping with self-criticism and shame that underpin many depression and anxiety disorders. James also works as a clinical psychologist in private practice. This is his first book, and of course, James is a very dear friend of mine. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. James Kirby. I'm particularly excited. And rather than dog ear the book, I've put in lots of little important passages that I want to be able to go back to. So I'm delighted about the publication, James, of Choose Compassion, Why It Matters and How It Works. Congratulations. How does it feel to have a book?
Yeah, great, but weird at the same time. Probably something you can relate to, I suppose.
A little bit, although it's sort of I mean, you're getting lots of really great feedback, and kind of it seems to be sort of making its way all over the world, and people are doing the photos, and it's
yeah, that's cool.
It's good stuff.
It is
good stuff.
It is. Sometimes don't know. Like, it's exciting to see it, but it's sometimes at a loss of what to say back outside of just that's amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great,
Yeah.
but it does feel a little bit. I don't know. You can't. I'm just not used to that kind of attention, I suppose. Usually the feedback I immediately get is all related to papers or grants I've submitted where they've just ripped me to shreds. What was done, and this is completely different. You put it out there and you get all this beautiful kind of feedback.
Yeah.
It's been a nice balancer, if you will.
That's actually fascinating to think about that, because yes, a lot of your work gets kind of scrutinized, and often it's also very highly appreciated, but it goes through that process of kind of critical review and so on. It's fun to have something out there that's just a colorful, lovely offering. I've got a lot of I've got a lot of questions for you, actually. So let's sort of power our way through all of that. I'm going to get you thinking a little bit, perhaps. So sorry about that.
Come into this in this relaxed frame.
Well, what I wanted to start with was I'm going to read the last paragraph of your prologue because it struck me right at the outset. It was inspiring. But human beings aren't perfect. We can be irrational, biased, sexist, prejudiced, and more. But we can also be profoundly compassionate. Over the course of this book, I'm going to examine not only what compassion is, but also how we go about deciding to be compassionate. I will look at how our emotions can get the better of us and how our logic can at times make us appear cold-hearted. I will consider humankind's confusing contradictions, such as ignoring mass levels of suffering, but then going to extraordinary lengths to prevent the pain of just one person. I will look at how compassion is developed within our families and cultures, and how compassion can be healing for those experiencing mental health difficulties. By going on this journey, I hope to answer a big question. With climate change, mass extinction, genocide, and war, can humans really lay claim to being compassionate? I think we can. It gives me little shivers to read that. Right, it does, right from the start. Sometimes I do find myself feeling a bit pessimistic, just when I think humanity is kind of, moving in a good direction or whatever, something happens. And it kind of hits hard. So, I wondered if you could talk to begin with just a bit about this optimism, I guess, that you feel, where that optimism comes from, and, where you think things are heading in the world in terms of compassion.
The big questions.
Starting with the big ones.
Yeah, I do have a lot of optimism. I think I've always, just by my temperament, have been pretty optimistic about everything in life. Although sometimes that can be kind of misread for some naivety or something like that. But generally speaking, my principle has always been like, people trying their best, people have goodwill at heart. So I try not to judge too much on what the actual intent of the situation could be. So it's kind of like, maybe it was just a mistake or something like that. And I probably got that from mum more than anyone. And so that quality in mum, I think, probably, through a whole host of nature and nurture has kind of come in me. And so I tend to try to look at the world probably in a more optimistic way. But of course, it's very easy for that to be kind of almost, what's the word, drained out of you. You hop on the news and social media as well, of course, and you just read and hear all this terrible stuff that's going on. So that does get you down and does get you kind of a bit angry and then disenchanted and then anxious. And so, that's why I kind of started the book like that, because it seems on one end, here we can be talking about a book that only talks about compassion. Like, that's amazing that there's a world that we can have books like that. And there are so many terrific books in that space. It's just fantastic. So it shows that people are keen and wanting and are interested and have an appetite for it. However, on the other hand, you see all that kind of dread and horror. It's sometimes hard to reconcile the two. But I think for me, what it comes back to is there is so much good going on. It's just we don't get exposed to it a lot of the time. And so I think I've got in there, maybe it's in the prologue or maybe not, but Fred Rogers, who does a lot of work with children's shows around emotions and understanding emotional well-being and trying to connect you into neighborhood. He always says, always look for the helpers whenever there are these disasters. And lo and behold, you look at climate change, you look at war and what's going on there, and you look at, the sexisms and the prejudice that are going on, and you can still, in all of those domains, see so many amazing people and groups of people trying to, address it head on, and they're getting movement, they get change, and you sort of see with waves across history change occur. And sometimes if I get too caught in the moment, I forget historically what amazing things have transpired, over the last even 50 years, let alone 1,000 years.
Yeah, I'd see that you have a kind of a optimistic temperament, I guess, and sort of passed down from your mum. But there is also just this anecdotal evidence, whether it be observing people now, noticing the changes over the many years. But of course, the thing I really appreciate about this book too is that it disentangles some of the research for us. There's actually scientific evidence, in a sense, that starts to make us or help us to feel a bit compassionate. We're getting a handle on human beings and compassion and what it is and how to kind of cultivate it and sort of continue this journey going forward. The research evidence, in a way, is cause for optimism as much as anything.
Yeah, I think, and this probably ties into probably a bit of Maslow kind of theory and Rogers. A lot of us have an internal drive to want to do things better. And I think part of that wanting to do better or progress as a species very much involves looking at ways that we can help cooperate, share, and work together. And of course, this all fits under that big banner of kind of pro-sociality, of which compassion plays a central role.
So let's dive in. Chapter 1. Compassion. So you sort of explore compassion, empathy, sympathy, various kind of, I guess, terms or constructs. You talk about motivation versus competencies, I guess, and so just sort of, I don't know, riff off that a little bit. What are what's the essence of some of the differences there, really, from your point of view? And we're trying to really pin down what compassion even is.
Everything has different. Every construct seems to have a different definition in psychology, and compassion's no different. We can't even agree necessarily on what an emotion is or what's happiness, and so what's compassion. There are some different views, but the kind of view that is kind of common amongst many is this idea that compassion's kind of this motivation. It's this motivation to be sensitive to the suffering you see, and then trying to do something to alleviate and prevent it. And so there are many things that can help with that process. So, for example, being emotionally moved or being sympathetic can help, that you engage in compassion. The same with empathy. So being able to get a sense of what the other person's thinking and feeling can be a really useful informer to compassion. But empathy, compassion's all about suffering, and empathy doesn't have to be about suffering. So there was a terrific study recently done where the researchers found we're far more often engaging in empathy with positive states than negative states. So empathy you can use beyond just a suffering state. We're 3 times more likely to engage with empathy with positive states than negative, whereas compassion's always sort of focused in on the suffering element, which empathy can, of course, help with. But that kind of means you've got to be able to sit with some, at times, unpleasant emotions or thoughts, which we can find really difficult. So I know some people can sit with sadness really, really well. However, when it comes to anger, that's kind of difficult. So when it comes to empathizing with someone who is feeling angry, that might be difficult to do because there's this uncomfortability that comes with experiencing anger, and anger is just a bad emotion. You should never experience it. And as soon as you kind of have that kind of association with it, it becomes difficult to empathically bridge in. But equally, like, you don't have to be 10 out of 10 in sympathy, empathy, or distress tolerance to help with that process of engaging in compassion. They can all be used at various levels. Some things are going to pull on my heartstrings more than others. If they can still help me kind of engage with it, that's the idea.
Yeah, so sympathy, we feel moved towards being helpful. Empathy, we sort of try to understand what's happening and how to be most helpful. And distress tolerance helps us with the emotions or other sort of feelings that might come up, in the context of suffering, because it's sort of approaching those negative emotions. It's funny because you start chapter 3 with the statement, we can't be compassionate to all if we rely solely on our emotions.
Yeah.
So can you unpack that a little bit in terms of, what you were just saying about feeling more or less moved towards suffering and versus this piece?
Yeah, I mean, there are many dimensions to that, I suppose, but we get emotionally moved by things that are kind of important to us. So, if I see my son upset, well, I'll be emotionally moved by that. But if I'm on a plane and my son's getting upset, the passenger behind could be quite irritated by the fact that my son's getting upset and isn't kind of emotionally moved. And rather, they might be having thoughts like, why'd you bring your bloody kid on this flight? We're going on this for the next 13 hours or whatever it might be. You're flying from Australia. So depending on who that target is, that can kind of shift our kind of orientation very quickly towards the suffering we see. And we can either become very blaming towards them, oh yeah, it's their fault kind of thing, because you might not like the person or whatever it might be. But if it's someone really close to you, if they're experiencing suffering and you really care about them and you really like them, we kind of will get swayed by emotion. Then that emotion is obviously critical to get the action stuff going. So those emotions kind of bring that energy that's kind of really helpful to kind of get some behavior into gear. And of course, when it comes to compassion, the behavior could be so many different things depending on the nature of the suffering you're addressing. But yeah, I mean, so as a result of that, there become boundaries on where my emotions will kick in and be helpful at addressing the upset versus those outside of that kind of inner circle almost, who I don't even see, they don't even register. Like, you know, I'm not even noticing or aware of, they're not in my kind of attentional sphere. Or conversely, I might even think to myself, well, yeah, they're kind of deserving of it. So there's no kind of emotional kind of movement of sympathy towards their pain. It's kind of like, well, you know, just rewards or karma or whatever it might be can kind of come into play. And they're not particularly helpful, obviously, for compassion. They come, but they're not particularly helpful. The other part of it, and this is something I talk about much later in the book, is the idea emotions are really good when it's one-on-one interaction of a compassion exchange. But as soon as those numbers start to increase and we start to hear 1 million people are caught up in perhaps a crisis, those numbers can be so overwhelming. It can kind of feel like there's nothing I can do. My help would be a drop in the ocean. And that can kind of lead people to feel I can't be of help. I can't really make a difference. And so they don't. Or alternatively, they feel so personally distressed and overwhelmed by it. They turn it off and disconnect.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. I guess what I got from the sentence is the sort of the point about we can't rely on our emotions. It sort of sounds like what you're saying is that emotional aspects can be very important in compassion and can be part of the motivation and so on. But actually sometimes the emotion might be too much. And so we sort of end up, kind of backing away. But sometimes the emotions can be can actually sort of turn us away because of sort of more negative emotions towards that person that might just naturally arise in us. So if it's not emotions we rely on, how do we choose compassion in amidst all of the emotional kind of storms and weather systems that we have to go through?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a great point you make, actually, because I'm thinking about that now even more. Like when I say rely, there's that aspect of will it get me going and acting compassion or not?
Yeah.
There's that part. But when you say rely, it also is, I'm kind of thinking about it, is it something I can trust in on? Like, is it a reliable source of information? Which can also mean that perhaps I engage in too much behavioral kind of action because the target is someone who is super important to me, say my son. And it's actually maybe better if I hold back sometimes when he's struggling to see himself work through some of the pain, but knowing I can come in and help at a different moment, perhaps. Sometimes you can jump in too quickly. So sometimes again, so it's kind of like the emotions, they're letting me know there's some kind of distress. Now, what do I do with that distress? And sometimes if the person's really close to me, I can feel even heightened, even more distress. And I must listen to this. I must do something immediately. And in fact, that's not such a reliable source of information to draw from because it's only listening to that emotion whereas actually that's my emotion response. What's the other person? How are they dealing with it? How are they going with it? And would this be, if it's not imminent hurt or pain, but it's more about a struggle and distress around effort, maybe there's a chance for me to sit back and let them continue through that, making mistakes, allowing them to make mistakes, recognizing that that's part of the learning process. So sometimes those emotions can block and stop us from certain groups, so we can't rely on it for behavior. But equally, sometimes they can be so powerful, they get us to take action, which perhaps we don't necessarily need to at that time.
And if I think about it, this is the beauty of the title of the book in a way, choose compassion, which really, it's interesting. It's not necessarily, just being kind of automatically moved towards compassion, but it's a choice. There's almost like a cognitive element too, or something about you go on to talk about morals and values, I think, and the role that those might play, and that sometimes we might choose compassion even when we do feel angry at that person whose child is crying on the airplane or whatever, because of certain values that we might feel, even though our emotion might not guide us that way.
Oh, exactly. So, that's that chapter really, is trying to focus in on this idea that, if we want sort of compassion to be realized globally, like on a global scale, and that's something that a new global compassion coalition steered by Rick Hansen and Jennifer Nadel are really doing, is this sense that emotions help with the everyday, people we're interacting with. But if we're trying to think of how would we go about creating environments, whether those be working environments, home environments, or whole country or city-based environments, what could we do to help facilitate compassionate interactions, or help our most vulnerable? And sometimes that requires us to kind of think more about what it is that we're wanting. So sort of engage in an element of mental time travel. So let's imagine 5 years from now, how do we want to live as a society or as a species, and where do we want to put some energy and effort into in order to help those particular people or groups or environment, if you will. So a lot of us has been doing a lot of time travel around climate and around what we need to be doing now in order to prevent disasters happening in the future, so that a lot of life, both animal and plant life and human life, can kind of be protected and saved. So that's kind of really compassionately motivated at its source, but we're engaging in all these kind of future thinking and planning and problem solving in order to address it in multiple ways, at country level ways, organizational level ways, and kind of individual kind of ways. But so I kind of get to this idea that if we want to recognize compassion more at a global scale, we need to start to, emotions aren't particularly good for that. They aren't big. It's not sensitive necessarily to that to the same degree. And also that means thinking about groups typically beyond your concern. And so again, it requires kind of, okay, well, let's connect with, what perhaps morals or ethics you have. The other part to that though is, compassion's often in the moment. You kind of you stumble across it, either personally or walking past someone, or someone calls you or something in distress. So compassion's often a reaction to what's come in at that point. But equally, I might not see it, but I might be thinking to myself, oh, how would I like to invest or spend my time? Or what could I perhaps do? Asking that question, what could I do to be of some kind of help? And sometimes that means, okay, well, I might seek out ways that I might proactively do something or take some kind of action to help a group. So, takes some of my donation behavior. There's a group called Effective Altruism that tries to look at where money can be best maximized, so you can get best return on helping life. And that takes out some of the emotional judgment I might have about what charities are useful to support or not support, and gives me a sense of taking that emotionality out because often we donate to charities that get us emotionally stirred up, or we've had some kind of connection with where there's emotion. And as a result, there are some areas that receive a lot of our support, but a lot of other areas that just don't at all. And so that's where I think, the thinking part can really just play devil's advocate a little bit. Okay, is there any other way you could spend that money, James? Or is there anything that you're doing on an instinctive level that's great, but also perhaps means someone else misses out? So just little things like that, just to broaden the kind of awareness. So just chat to someone, my wife, Cassie, I'm thinking we should do that. What do you reckon? Is at its core, it's good, but is there something else I've missed? So just that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's sort of feeling, thinking, values, planning, committing. There's sort of a lot to it. So where does all this come from? I saw a Dalai Lama post on his Facebook page. I assume it's him posting. It was on the 13th of April, 2020. And he said, I think he talks about this a bit, but he sort of said, I often think of my mother as my first teacher of compassion. She was simple, uneducated, just a village farmer, but so kind, kind-hearted, and her kindness was unconditional. It's the love with which she nurtured me that is the core of the compassion I can find in myself and feel for others. This very basic level of affection is natural to human beings. And I mean, you emphasize this in your book as well. And I know this is a very important, impactful part of your work and your research, and that is just the importance of family, and sort of those early experiences and the role for that in all of this cultivating compassion. So, your thoughts?
Yeah,
there?
No, that's probably it's probably, if I was to list the top 3 take homes, that would probably be number one, how important family is for compassion. I mean, there was a big study done in Finland with 2,500 individuals who they tracked over 3 decades. And then they were trying to predict what factors predicted compassion levels 30 years down the line. And they looked at a whole host of things, gender, cohort, social economic status, mental health difficulties, and so on. And the number one, the only significant factor that predicted the compassion 30 years down the line was the emotional warmth that they got from their parents. And so emotional warmth is just really important, which speaks directly to what the Dalai Lama has kind of said there in that tweet or Facebook post. So gracefully, certainly much better worded post than my posts tend to be. Hey, look at me having a bit up the coast. He's coming out with this wisdom. The emotional warmth that we get from our primary caregivers is crucial for so many things, as well as compassion down the line. And your work has even done that, Stan. So work you've done, I think, with Marcella and Alison Creed, maybe. Is that right? Who looked at emotional warmth in childhood, helped buffer from psychopathology or feelings of shame or something. It was like that as well. So memories of being able to, if you can access easily memories of that emotional warmth and safeness that you had in childhood, it can buffer from psychopathology, but also I think you found it had high levels associated self-compassion as well.
That's right. Yeah. The findings there were interesting. The sort of early memories of warmth and safeness predicted sort of better psychological well-being, but that was mediated by the self-compassion. And the flip side, I think, is true too, because by the time we get to chapter 5 in your book, it's sort of you comment about how childhood memories of high shame and low warmth really lead to higher fears of compassion. So I guess early life experiences and experiences in one's family or one's caregiving kind of arrangements can sort of influence things both ways in a way.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of almost catch-22 or, chicken or the egg kind of scenario. And in so much of like, well, yeah, compassion also predicts parents' willingness to give emotional warmth to their kids. And so, how does this all work out? It's kind of tricky. It's all kind of clear, linked in without kind of definitive clear, well, this is where it starts and so on. But these are the factors that are implicated within. And fortunately, there are things we can do to help increase parents' emotional warmth if it is an area that needs a bit of help. But equally, we can also improve compassion as well. So there are many pathways in to trying to be of help, depending whatever the difficulty is. But certainly, if your childhood has been one where your primary source of care has also been your primary source of threat, it can become very difficult for people, because all of a sudden, those kind of immediate kind of schemas or beliefs that you have around they're loving, with loving comes care, affection, warmth, but with supposed to be loving, but they're hitting me or calling me names or just ignore me completely, that can really disrupt the attachment relationship, but then can also generalize beyond, because it's like, trusting other humans becomes very difficult. So how do I trust a stranger? You've got no connection to me at all. Why should I trust you? My family, I should trust because, I'm their kid and, they should be loving, and I can't even trust them. So why should I trust you, kind of thing can kind of happen for some, which is obviously terrible, but that's where the fears of compassion can kind of come from.
You really influenced me the other day. We were talking and you mentioned that the study, and I'll get you to describe it actually, but it's the one where they compared supportive texts versus supportive phone calls versus supportive face-to-face conversations, I think. But I'm not sure if those were the three groups, but that seemed to be a very practical tip almost in terms of how to cultivate warmth, in your relationships with maybe kids and stuff. Can you just tell us that study again?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a study with 7.5-year-olds who had to do a really stressful task. So that would have to be perform difficult math and verbal problems and in front of a group of panel of adults. And of course, that's very stressful. And they don't get any feedback from the adults. So it's done in this kind of very sterile way. And of course, they can never complete or successfully the task. So it's very upsetting for the 7.5-year-olds. And then after they finish that process of around 15 minutes or so, they're put in one of 4 groups. So one group is they get to see mum, be with mum, so touch and everything and hear. One is they can just be left alone for 15, for the extended period of time. And then the third is they get to speak to mum on the phone, or the fourth is they get a text message from mum. Now, mums are always instructed to say the exact same thing back. So that's kind of controlled for across those conditions. And what they were interested in was the release of oxytocin in the 7.5-year-old. So oxytocin is like a bonding hormone, often a kind of sense of, sometimes it's kind of referred to as the love hormone as well. It has a lot of roles, but that's one of them. And also they were measuring cortisol in the child, which is obviously a stress hormone. And they wanted to see if oxytocin was being released and if cortisol was dropping in those conditions with mum. Now, I immediately thought, like most people, well, being left alone would be the worst for sure. And being able to be in the presence of mum would be the best, absolutely for sure. And I didn't really know what the other two, how they would fold out. But you already know the answer, so there's no point in guessing around. But what they found was being able to speak to mum and the presence of mum, those two groups were equally as effective at releasing oxytocin, reducing cortisol. Texting mum had no influence whatsoever. It was like you were left alone. And so for me, the kind of take home from that study was, how often do we, after experiencing a setback or a disappointment, regulate that experience through texting someone we care about? And I know I do that a lot. It's almost second nature. You go in, you do something. It might be after this podcast, I text Cassie, oh, it's horrible. But, we're hoping that has an emotional impact on us when we hear back from that person. Oh, I'm sure you're okay. I'm sure you were great. I'm sure your jokes were fantastic. Kind of the reassurance that kind of comes back. But perhaps that's not as powerful as what we think it is. And it's incredible how powerful voice is, So, sensory modality is really important in terms of how we experience information and what that information is trying to convey. And tone of voice is huge. And that's one of the biggest things that led to the development of CFT was Paul Gilbert honing in on this idea of what is your inner tone like? How are you speaking to yourself? What's that affective tone like? How do people talk to you? What's their tone like? And, as babies, one of the best regulators we have is our tone of voice. Also touch, of course, but tone of voice and touch. But yeah, how we speak to each other matters, and how we speak to ourselves, it matters.
And so in that study, the being in person with the mum or speaking to her on the phone were equally effective, and texting and being by oneself in a room were equally ineffective, or, just to say it in simple terms. Yeah,
it just didn't have an impact. And
didn't have an impact.
We rely so much on texting. That's still okay, still fine. But obviously the texting doesn't carry the emotional meaning, or sometimes we read the text in the emotional state we're in, right? So you're frustrated reading the tone and there's still that leakage in. Whereas when you have the presence or you're hearing, you're actually getting a disruption to that emotional state by this other emotional state coming in, of course.
Yeah, no, that was very food for thought, because I think we do rely on texts. I have a son who's currently away at schoolies week. So, I was sort of texting him, but then, after our conversation, I thought, I really should ring him, give him some wise, soothing, verbal tones from his father, but he didn't answer. So that was that.
Well, he does what we all do, right? Like, I tend to screen phone calls a lot because it's just like, I'm busy, you're on, just text us. But you miss that emotional connection. And we minimize how important conversations are, like verbal conversations are there. They are really helpful, and because they show we care about each other, and it's vibrant and buoyant, and often goes better than what we think. But, it's not that every interaction has to be via voice. It's just like, if you are distressed and you're wanting to regulate the distress, you're much better being able to hear someone's voice than none.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really, really great, kind of practical tip. And actually, your book was full of various practical tips. I thought it was. I always love your compassion in the morning practice. I think you attribute that to Paul mostly, but yeah, page 97, everyone. There's a great little practice there that James offers us. But yeah, so tell us about that one.
Yeah, it's just it's absolutely Paul Gilbert's. He calls it compassion under the duvet, but I'm Australian, so duvet doesn't really cut through. And I was like, what's this duvet business? And so I went with compassion in the morning, or even compassion with my coffee kind of thing. But it's just a way to orientate the beginning of a day. And I it really resonated with me because I am not a good morning person. I think you know that about me, Stan. I don't enjoy waking up early.
I must admit, I haven't been there in that moment very often, but
yeah, that's right. But no,
I have heard.
Paul Cassie's bared the brunt of just waking up and just everything's a bit of a grumpy kind of soul. Everything's tricky. Of course, you wake up and you do all the things you're not supposed to do, check the phone, see your emails, and, and you're already behind, running late, and they all tend to stack up. So this is just a way of cutting through that. And really the idea is you just wake up and maybe just connect to your breath just for a cycle or two, no more than 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and then just kind of welcome yourself to the morning using an inner friendly tone of voice, an emotional warmth voice, if I can. So that could be like, hi, James, or something like that. And usually when you suggest that to someone, they just start laughing. And that's exactly kind of what you want. You're kind of looking for that kind of emotional fun or playfulness, if you will, to start your day. And then it's kind of like, okay, after I've welcomed myself to the day like that, it's kind of focusing in on, okay, if I was to be at my compassionate best, how would my day look? How would I relate to people? How would I talk to them? How would I feel towards them? What actions would I take, and so on? And that just immediately, not that I have any data on it, but that immediately transformed how I'd start the day. And it often mean like I roll over, give Cass a kiss on the cheek, get out of bed. And this was really important to me because I was about to become a dad, and I wanted those first interactions with him in the morning, and just generally anyway, to be ones where I was giving him the sense that it was good to see him, so I wanted to give him that kind of feeling. But if I woke up grumpy and I was afraid with that, like, would I get irritated and frustrated? And there are many opportunities to get irritated and frustrated. So I was kind of like, I need to do something to address this. So there was a strong motivation to really do it too.
Yeah, and it's just a great example of something, well, sort of smallish. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of time, at least, but it begins the day with a choice. That's the first moment of choosing compassion, setting a compassionate intention, yes, sort of with family and so on. But then, kind of leaving home for the day, and it just begins the day from a compassionate motivation. It's interesting.
Paul and Nico maybe do. I think it was them who came up with it, but maybe someone else did. But this idea of, if you were upset and you looked at your face in the mirror, and it was, say, your angry face that you were looking at, and if you were looking at that angry face, looking at you upset, how would you feel? Or, would you want to tell them what's upsetting you? Or, what would you like to do? And it's kind of like, so often when I'm upset, there can often be this anger directed internally at me. And it kind of is that kind of feeling of being frowned upon, being looked down upon. Whereas if you change that to, imagine an emotionally warm face, a face that's really interested in you and is delighted at seeing you. If you have that face, look at that face in the mirror, and you imagine being upset and going to that face, how would you feel? What would you like to do? What would you say? And it for me, doing that exercise in a compassion retreat totally had a profound impact on my immediate body kind of jolting, kind of, oh my God, contrasting that with the warm face to the angry face just had a massive, it was just chalk and cheese. So I'm thinking, when my child comes up to me upset, sometimes I'm getting angry because they're too loud, and that's the upset part. They're upset, they're really loud, and if I'm coming in with the anger, it's not really like the angry face kind of thing. It's not really a face you want to go to or turn to or feel like it's being emotionally supported.
Isn't it interesting? It's all these sort of little parts of our humanity, the voice tone, the facial expression, they're so key really to switching on something, something that then kind of leads to compassion.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that of course ties into that morning routine exercise, I suppose. Just yes, deliberately and on purpose in that. So small and so subtle, but I'm very grateful for it.
Yes, and I love that. I love the word delight. I think there's something very powerful in experiencing or offering others a sense of you're delighted to see them. That's a really kind of great place to start any interaction. There's all this stuff kind of in the body, and you mentioned HRV, heart rate variability. I guess, which is a sort of an interesting kind of segue from voice tone and facial expression and body and so on. It's in chapter 7, the difficulties of self-compassion. What is HRV, and how does it relate to compassion and self-compassion in 20 words or less?
Yeah, exactly. HRV, or heart rate variability, is just a biometric really that we can use to get a sense of what the body's experiencing. So it's highly linked in to your parasympathetic system. So if you think of your body with the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic system helps with all that arousal of energy to take action, do things, equally protect you from hurt or danger. Whereas the sympathetic system has almost the opposite influence on the body, where it's trying to really slow things down in many ways. And so it has like an opposing force on the body's vital organs that your sympathetic system has. So your sympathetic system would, for example, not be sending energy into metabolism. Metabolizing at a point where you're wanting to take action isn't useful. Use of the energies within your body, it's wanting you to take action, move, etc., etc., etc. But if you're parasympathetically activated, you will go into a state of metabolism because you're no longer wanting, pushing, trying to get away from, etc. So sometimes that kind of parasympathetic system is sometimes referred to as the rest and digest system as well. And if you've got high parasympathetic system activity, that's indicative of a higher heart rate variability. So HRV is just a measure of the parasympathetic system of the body. And of course, what we're trying to do with a lot of compassion training is to try to help the person to be able to self-regulate their distress in ways that are comforting and reassuring, to kind of shift away from a dominant kind of sympathetic system, which has a lot of stress, pressure, urgency, and if overstimulated for a long period of time can lead to you feeling burnt out, shut down, and rather trying to be able to strengthen this parasympathetic of your autonomic nervous system so that it can help you during those periods of stress, particularly in the recovery post-stress. So you can't stop the stresses, they're going to keep coming in. But how do you relate and respond to yourself after the stressor has passed? And so compassion can really help with that. And compassion is really associated with much higher heart rate variability. So there's a significant association between the two. DeBello, Christiana Ottaviani, and Nico Petrocchi have done some amazing work looking at those kind of associations. I don't know if that was a lot more than 20 words, but
that's great. That's great. But I one quick little question: does the sympathetic and parasympathetic also map onto the cortisol and oxytocin you were mentioning before, or is it kind of more complicated than that, I suppose?
Yeah, it kind of becomes very complicated with a lot of moving parts. So. Just by, I mean, in some ways, in Paul's earlier days, he kind of did do a bit of that kind of linking in. However, at the same time, like oxytocin, if your offspring are in danger of getting, like imminent danger of getting hurt, oxytocin is the big driver to kind of like protective kind of behaviors, to look after the kids. So it kind of stimulates a sympathetic kind of, fight response. So, these hormones, depending on the person and your relationship with that person or group, kind of works in kind of complicated ways. Robert Sapolsky quite a lot about some of this work in his book, Behave. It's a terrific book.
Okay. Well, we're really starting to sort of map it out across the chapters, like I can sort of see the spider diagram in my mind. There's the emotions we've talked about, the thoughts we've talked about, the physiology or bodily sensations, where does the attention go? How do we sort of shift that about? And the motivation behind it all. Chapter 8 was really interesting to me because you talked about suffering, but there was a bit about, how it seems humans kind of like to suffer. You mentioned Paul Bloom's work. Bloom's work about the pleasure associated with suffering or chosen suffering. And I thought chosen suffering was an interesting term given the title of your book. It was sort of sometimes people might choose suffering or something. But what is this suffering and pleasure kind of paradox all about?
Yeah, well, read Paul Bloom's The Sweet Spot, which talks about the pleasures of suffering. He will do a much better job than I. Paul's extraordinary. Paul Bloom, that is. Well, both Pauls. I must name my next kid Paul. It must lead to good spelling. But essentially, a lot of people will have this hedonic view of life that really, happiness is the core thing we should be chasing, and you can kind of accumulate it across time. You kind of add up all of the happiest moments and the sad moments, and at the end of the day, or bad moments, and you want to, at the end of the day, have more happier moments than bad moments, and then that's a good life. And so, hedonists really kind of push that kind of way of thinking, and everything we basically do, whether or not we recognize it as such, is kind of driven towards maximizing that kind of pleasure element of it. But Paul kind of talks a little bit in that book, and me a little bit in this book, is there's really two parts. Is, we can fear anything, but equally we can take pleasure in almost anything too. And there are people who take great pleasure in watching horror movies, for example. I don't really. Some humans take pleasure in shocking themselves. I kind of talk a bit in the book there about how people will, even at arcade games, pay to hop in an electric chair and get a shock. Like, I would never do that. But some people enjoy that kind of stuff. And so, he unpacks that to a degree. In the book, what I was really trying to focus on was this idea that, not all suffering's equal. Like, we kind of use suffering as kind of like a broad term, but, suffering can encompass so many different forms of suffering, like emotional, physical, lack of resource. But equally, there are things that I will choose to do for a reason, for meaning, which will come with a lot of effort. And that effort can often be very draining, and I can be anxious about meeting deadlines, frustrated, and so on. And so I experience these discomforting emotional experiences or suffering, but it's all towards something I've chosen and it's meaningful for me. So one could be writing the book. Writing the book was something I chose to do, but writing at times was just really hard. There were swear words and I don't know, stuff, giving up, all this kind of stuff. So I was suffering, but that was a very different type of suffering to the type of suffering that you might experience if you were to be beaten up by your dad, right? And so, being beaten up by your dad, you haven't chosen to be beaten up. This is not something anyone would want. And you're still, as you're being beaten up, you're feeling anxious, scared, vulnerable, upset. So, I talk about suffering a lot, but, that kind of suffering is, of course, not equal. And sometimes the strategies we talk about in terms of being compassionate to that suffering, or being compassionate when relating to your distress, there's a lot more nuance in that. Sometimes it is very important to recognize people are fearful of doing that because they've gone through some horror, which is not the same as being upset because my sentence didn't flow as well that I wanted to for when I wrote. So I kind of try to unpack that a little bit. So we've got chosen a life areas we want to pursue, and if we see them being meaningful, we're willing to tolerate the suffering that comes with it. Think of running a marathon or whatever it might be. Even parenting is a bit like that. There's some good research that shows your happiness drops significantly as you become a parent in those first early years compared to pre-being a parent. But the meaning you derive in your everyday life increases. And then there are other factors that will also influence that, how much support you have around you and childcare and so on. But there's that. I mean, there's probably a lot there you can kind of dig into. But
I mean, it's a really fascinating chapter. I thoroughly enjoyed that, and I guess it is. There's a lot of things that might be good or good for us or mean a lot to us that we do, even though it causes us, kind of sort of some suffering. But not all suffering is necessarily the same, and being kind of aware of the chapter's called The Anatomy of Suffering. I guess that's what you're trying to sort of disentangle there. I mean, I've just relatively recently joined a gym, and I've started Zumba classes. And in that first class, I suffered.
Exactly. Well, I mean, but the thing is, it's not purposeless suffering, right?
That's right.
You're getting something from it. And it's the same as in therapy. Like when we do things like exposure, and I'm not. I read somewhere recently someone say we should stop using the word exposure. It's not a great phrase. And they were like, what are some other ways we could call this process? And someone said, oh, I call it courage quests with my kids. And I was like, that's the coolest name ever. Like that is something I'm interested in. I want to engage with. I'd want to do. And it's kind of like, sometimes if people have a strong fear to compassion, one of the ways to work with it is to slowly bringing them into contact with compassion so they can start to have a different experience with it and start to learn a more helpful way of engaging with it so they can benefit. But that's purposeful. Bringing them into contact with that, though, is still distressing, but it's purposeful distress. We're not doing it for any old reason, just to make you experience more pain. It's not a sadist. We're doing it because we know through very good science that if we expose ourselves to these experiences, we start to be able to recognize that they are safer than what we had experienced in the past, but also we can learn new ways of being with it and actually start to take joy within it as well. So it's purposeful. And you kind of explain that, with the client as part of informed consent about what it is you're going to do or what's the aim of it. But, going to Zumba, you're not doing it just to, pain yourself. You're doing it, I would imagine, partly for your own health.
Yes, that's right. That's right. But that, yeah, I mean, a good life or a life that's good for us isn't always a life that feels good. It can be, and this is why strength and courage and commitment, sort of are all major parts of compassion for others or for ourselves. Chapter 9 went on to talk about when compassion collapses, and you mentioned that notion a little bit earlier. And then chapter 10, compassionate contradictions. I was just going to read another little sentence.
Book looks good.
How much was? Here's the receipt. How much was this book? But you say here, humans are walking contradictions, and in our compassionate behaviour, we're no different. We take actions to be compassionate, but still do other things that may cause suffering. And you mentioned there that you discovered almost a contradiction of your own, but that was previously unknown to you, the sort of the orangutans and so on. And people can read that story in the book. But I thought it was interesting because it was sort of like a contradiction. It was sort of outside of your awareness, and when it came into your awareness, I think it motivated you to change. But I'm sort of curious too, when people have contradictions, but they're kind of actually fully aware of those as well a little bit, and they persist with certain things anyway. I mean, I suppose it's a relatively tricky kind of topic, but like dairy cows, egg-laying chickens, pigs kept in cages, and yet all of that suffering often doesn't motivate people to sort of make a change or away from consuming animals. So what do you make of that sort of when the contradiction is sort of known to the person or they're aware of it, and yet there they are kind of still stuck in that contradiction?
Yeah, it's a really interesting area of work, and there are some terrific researchers out there looking at the contradiction at differing levels. So on one level, there might be this contradiction around, try to be compassionate to all life. However, on the other hand, I eat animals that have been raised in not good conditions. And that would seem a contradiction. However, on another level, you might see yourself as, kind of masculine kind of guy. And if I was to adhere to that sort of masculine kind of ideal, eating meat's really important. And, we're the top of the food chain, we can eat whatever we want kind of thing. And so I can remain congruent with that kind of idea. But whereas eating, a more sort of plant-based diet might be contradictory to that. And so that's a different kind of motivational force then. It's like, how are others seeing me or judging me, or what are the social norms in my environment like? And so we might have contradictions arise as we're trying to be compassionate, but equally taking those actions might then contradict another kind of desire or want socially. So, a lot of people And I talk about some research done with different people's different diets and people's views towards those people with diets as they attend functions. And, if you say to people you're vegan, a lot of people immediately have a lot of annoyance towards you. Not you as a person, but just the kind of idea of veganism. And so, often you might then keep that kind of hidden and not share it. But, because you don't want to get the backlash. But alternatively, there's part of you that's like, no, this is a really important way of life that, I only found out from someone telling me, maybe I should tell them and really push the point. And so there's constant contradictions. And so I can imagine some people can walk easily around with contradictions because they just change the plane of judgment. So one plane of judgment is through the lens of compassion. Is it compassion or not? But another plane of judgment I can assess on is it living up to my kind of social norms of being a man or being a father or being an Australian or something? And if that's incongruent, well, if that's congruent, that can kind of be what I choose to focus in on because it's easier. So, when cognitive dissonance comes in, we can kind of, just avoid the whole thing together, or it can be something which then we go, you know what, we'll try to do something different. I guess the thing is, it constantly ripples. Like what we're told today about how to live a healthy lifestyle is very different to what my grandparents were told. So we've got a sea of information coming through, kind of informing us on the best ways to live our lives. And it can be sometimes very difficult to know, well, they're telling me this one day, then this the next. It's, it's a nightmare.
Yeah, there's these contradictions, and we do seem adept at wriggling our way out of the cognitive dissonance, I suppose. Somehow or other the mind is able to do that. And the other thing that occurred to me as you were speaking, you mentioned what it is to be a man, for example, might be in amongst it. I suppose really there's often contradictions, and there will be some aspects of that are in our awareness, but there'll be other aspects of it that still aren't in our awareness. And I went recently to a motivational interviewing, you mentioned that before, a conference, and Professor Bill Miller, who's the kind of one of the founders really of MI, he's now talking about horizontal and vertical ambivalence. That horizontal ambivalence might be the two sides of something that are well within our awareness, but vertical ambivalence is where some aspects of our ambivalence are outside of our awareness, and sometimes to kind of work through dilemmas or to sort of make certain choices to change and so on. It really is about bringing those unconscious aspects of ambivalence into consciousness and awareness, and being able to, kind of tease through all of it, I guess. The person who perhaps from a compassionate point of view feels like maybe they should move towards a plant-based diet, then starts to bring awareness to this, what it is to be a man concept, and how their manliness is attached to eating meat or something, as you said. They can then start to, if that's now in their awareness, they can start to sort of disentangle that and factor that in and see whether that actually, is an important motivator, or maybe it isn't, or whatever. But yeah, it's sort of being able to bring awareness to the contradictions and the ambivalences.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what Don't Look Up, that movie, was really all about,
Yeah.
This human contradiction of here's an immediate and impending disaster that we could avoid if we work together and bring attention and so on. And it was all working really, like for a lot of it, the movie, people really, after the initial shock, start to galvanize together and coordinate a way to stop this disaster from occurring. But, within that, there was one group who kind of still saw this as an opportunity for advantage. That kind of competitive kind of motivational force that just override it all and led to our destruction. It's kind of like, it is. It's not the fact that all humans are bad or good. It is a case of, these things with time, our capacity to be able to see into the future and kind of resist immediate temptation, if you will, at certain moments is really hard. really difficult. And we're still working through how best to use that. And we haven't quite worked that one out well. Still a lot more science to do. I mean, not many other species spend as much time, I think, as what we do on trying to imagine the future world and what it will look like. A lot is just immediately focused in on the now. So how do you go about creating a future world where we are kind of trying to enable us all to have a good life, as you say? And so we've had groups like UN and WHO emerge, World Health Organization. They're just phenomenal with the kind of work that they're trying to do and promote, greater health and well-being. So, focusing in on this kind of stuff is just crucially important.
And that's where you finish the book, really, is the future of compassion and where we're heading with all of that. And it finishes on once again a sort of an optimistic note. Thank you, James.
Well, what's the bottom book that makes you depressed?
Well, I think it's justifiable optimism. So we're looking good. But thank you for writing this book, James. I do. It's a great contribution. It's a very easy read and yet kind of provides a lot of food for thought and insight and so on. I think I said somewhere that people who know you will hear your voice in amongst the pages of Choose Compassion, and people who don't know you will get to know you by reading this book. The kindness and kind of wisdom and insight shines through. What was it like writing it? Well, you sort of mentioned before it was up and down, I guess, but yeah, like how did it feel writing a book, kind of working with the editors, getting it published?
Oh, the editors were fabulous. So Madonna Duffy and Margot Lloyd, they were just so helpful in helping shape how I was trying to express things and cutting out a lot of waffle. I would have had a lot more pop culture references in there. But already some of the feedback I've got was from one reader was, I didn't realize how much you loved movies. So, right. Okay. So it's probably good I reduced the amount of references, but I said yes to writing the book about literally, 4 or 5 days before the pandemic first began in 2020. And so that's always been there across the whole duration of writing the book, which has kind of, in some ways, brought compassion to the fore, because it was like, how were we as a community dealing with this kind of, catastrophe, if you will. And there was so much compassionate response going out. It was extraordinary. And in some ways, it was very inspiring to write, at times. But it also meant that there were times where I was just locked downstairs in my Harry Potter cupboard whilst Cassie was trying to look after the kids. And it was just so hard, and getting motivated to, you're doing everything else, and then to get motivated to try to come up with something that someone would want to read. There were just times it didn't come easily, and there were frustrated writings done. But overall, it was great, and I learned a whole bunch myself, because there were parts that I just hadn't dug into a lot, like compassion, contradictions, and compassion in different parts of the world and how it's expressed, and how in different cultures it can be big influence on that. And certainly AI, artificial intelligence, and sort of thinking about that. They're just things that I probably didn't spend a lot of time focusing on, but I had to read a lot about. So that was cool.
Well, we really appreciate the effort that you put into all of that. It's no doubt soon to be on the bestseller list, James. We'll sort of try to make that happen. A couple of quick fire questions. Okay. Who is your favorite clinical psychologist in the world?
Oh, you can't ask me that. It's like saying your favorite child. Move on.
You were supposed to just automatically say you, Stan, and we were going to move on anyway. Secondly,
oh, that's such a hard question, Lord. What would yours be? Can I ask back? Can I ask questions back?
Well, let's move on to the next one. So, and how do you keep your hair so perfectly messy?
Oh, by doing this.
Okay. And give us, one last, little practical tip to help us choose compassion. What would you leave us with on that?
Buy the book. No,
Buy
no,
the
no.
book.
I don't know. I think maybe it's just, I think probably the best teacher of compassion is actually seeing it. And so I think the best tip is just try to see it in your everyday life. And if you go looking for it, you'll see it. And then compassion's contagious. If you see it or receive it, it's much more likely you yourself will give it to another person. So I honestly think, if you can keep an eye out for it, and if your intention can be, okay, I'm going to try to spot compassion today, that will actually lead you to being more compassionate yourself. And I think that's probably one area which we just have not harnessed. The humans are massive imitators. We tend to over-imitate. I think a really wonderful way to help increase compassion is just to show it much more, because things we see, we tend to do.
Beautiful. That's a really great piece of advice. I think we can all put that bit into practice. Well, thanks, James, for I've taken quite a bit of your time here this afternoon, so I appreciate that. So thanks for being on Compassion in a T-shirt, by the way.
No, my first time on the series. I love your Compassion in a T-shirt series, and thank you so much for giving up your time and reading the book so quickly. Oh my God, that's amazing.
Yeah, no,
I've got to say, people like you who you appreciate those people like you who have written books, because you read what they've done, you go, oh my God, that's so clever how they did that. You can kind of appreciate other people's writing a little bit once you've tried yourself. And certainly, I certainly experienced that when I look back on your gifts of compassion, going for little bits and pieces for inspiration. Oh God, that was so clever the way you did that, to help, because you're looking at it through a different perspective.
Very nice. All right. Thanks, James. We will see you soon.
Catch you, Stan.